Today, we're leaving the house and we're gonna go shoot some photos. So I know that in the intro sequence I actually packed my X Pro 2. I changed my mind on that and we're going with a different camera today.
Voiceover Steven here to tell you what goes through my head, and as you can see we're shooting on the X100F today because I wanted something a little more handheld. Here I'm just getting warmed up, testing the exposure and seeing how the light is playing with everything. I'm switching my aperture between f2 and f5.6 throughout this video, but always shooting an aperture priority with back button focus and exposure locking. I see this guy at the bus stop with the light behind him and think it might be a cool shot. It wasn't really, but again, just getting warmed up. A lot of my photography is taken from the hip as I'm moving if I have the shutter speed to allow for it. Again, getting warmed up. I usually like bus stop photos, but at this focal length and distance, this just wasn't a good shot. I think so much of street photography is just capturing people in their normal element, which is what I'm trying to do here. I kind of wish I would have stopped here and taken the time to get a photo of the shadow on the wall because I kind of like that. Then I see the bus doors are still open and I think it could be an opportunity for an interesting shot. Other than the blue-red color contrast, this photo is very dull. Personally, I blame the subject, but we keep moving. Because we're shooting street photography, obviously not every photo is going to be perfectly posed, but you win some, you lose some. Architecture photography is always nice to get, and it's a bonus that the lighting is good and there's a reflection. I kinda like this photo. You can see here and in many of my photos that come that my shadows are more on the cooler tone. With it being winter, I wanted to convey the colder temperatures in my shadows while keeping the highlights warmer since I'm shooting near golden hour. Even though it's nearly 70 degrees and I'm walking around in shorts. I saw this guy from across the street and knew that with this focal length I could accentuate the scale of the buildings compared to the subject. Then it was all about waiting for him to be in a good frame. I think that photo's okay, but I wish I would have put the subject in the lower third to again accentuate the height of the buildings. I came back to get a photo of him with the shrubs framing him too. I saw this parking garage and thought that the opening could make a good frame. I think that's a major part of street photography is just finding elements within the scene that you can use to frame stuff with. As you can see, I'm moving closer and closer to the opening to get that good frame. You don't always have the opportunity to frame up your shots the way that you want when doing street photography because a lot of times it's spur of the moment. Luckily in this instance, I had the time. Once I have the frame that I want, I'm just waiting for there to be no cars and for the subject to walk into the frame. Again, a lot of times with street photography, you don't have the opportunity to wait for the perfect conditions. Luckily here, my subject was just kind of meandering around that area, so I could wait for the cars to pass by to get his photograph. I thought that he was such a good subject that I decided to get a different angle of him, using the lines on the ground as leading lines to make him more of a focal point within the image. And then we keep moving. I think in one of my previous videos I talked about the importance of having comfortable shoes when doing street photography, because it's really just all walking. This park downtown is usually pretty active. Unfortunately, at this time of day, there wasn't a whole lot going on. And a lot of times, that's the kind of thing you run into with street photography, especially in a city that you know pretty well. You start to find areas that you go to a lot because you know you'll get a good photo. But sometimes it just isn't there, and that's okay. It's still always good to give it a shot. This photo is kind of dull, so we keep moving. Parking garages are sometimes my favorite places to shoot because I can get that aerial view. In a lot of cities, I feel like you don't have a lot of opportunity to get those high-up shots, but a parking garage is always a great publicly accessed place that you can go to get those. Whenever I get to a parking garage, I'll usually start by looking over the railings to see if there's anything going on below me. In this case, there wasn't really anything. I'll also check to see if there's any interesting things within the parking garage itself. A lot of times you can find discarded trash or graffiti or certain elements that can be interesting to photograph. But it was a surprise to find a pickleball court up here. And that's one of the fun things about street photography, is that you always kind of notice something new every time you go out. They normally have a drive-in theater up here, and these screens and projector trailers are sometimes pretty interesting. Unfortunately, this time the lighting wasn't great. Again, checking the railings and chasing light. And that's a big factor when shooting at this time of day, is just chasing the light, finding where that low light is either creeping between buildings or being reflected, and finding those contrast points. Obviously, at other times of day or in different weather conditions, the principles you would follow would be different. But in this video, with me going out at golden hour, those are the elements that I'm looking for. I realized that again at this focal length, I wasn't going to get anything in focus from that high up, so I keep moving. A lot of times I don't like to stick around to see if a subject appears. I like to capture stuff on the fly. Up ahead I see some people on scooters, so I'm checking my exposure and shutter speed here to see if I can get a good follow photo that'll produce blur. It's something that I do pretty often, especially when shooting aperture priority. As I approach a subject, I'll usually lock my exposure beforehand, knowing what kind of photo I want to get, and then I'll lock my focus once I get there. I didn't get the subject perfectly in focus like I wanted to, but I like that he was staring down the barrel. And again, this is just something you run into sometimes when you're trying different techniques while you're out shooting. It's not always about just freezing the moment. Sometimes you want to introduce other elements into your photography like blur, and sometimes it doesn't work. Here's a good example of light play with the coffee sign producing a shadow on the wall. I was just waiting for my subject to stand up within the frame and moving to get my shadow out of the image. As you can see on the left side of this video, there's a woman walking through patches of light and dark. If I'd have seen that originally, I probably would have stayed there to see if I could capture somebody walking into the light, but sometimes you don't notice everything. There's obviously certain elements that you want to try to put in every photo to make it a decent photo, such as foreground and background elements, and of course, an interesting subject. Here I'm just trying to frame the subject between the two objects on either side of them to create good foreground elements and a frame. But this photo didn't turn out that great. We keep moving, and I kind of wish I would have gotten this photo now instead of when he had already passed me, because right now he would have been well backlit and the light would have been more interesting. Once he turned around, it was all in shadow and it was a terrible photo. I'm not even going to show it here. But that happens sometimes, and I think that that's an important part of street photography, is understanding your mistakes and knowing when you can improve. Again, just trying to get some light play, and these sunbeams are pretty nice. I probably could have stuck around there a little longer, but once the subject notices me taking photos, their demeanor usually changes, and so I don't like to stick around too long. This guy was just vibing, and I couldn't not get his photo. That's one of the things that I like about carrying around the smaller camera on the hand strap, is that it's always at the ready. If I had been looking for abstract elements, those three pillars against the blue sky would have made a great photo. Sometimes you go out with certain intentions and therefore miss other photos. Like I said before, I don't normally sit around and wait for subjects to come into frame, but I really liked this sunbeam and decided it would be a good opportunity to take a break. Eventually I did a few subjects that passed through it. You can see I'm moving my exposure compensation down to around -1.6 to bring those shadows down. I could do this in post, but I do like to get it in camera. And that's usually because I only edit the JPEG, since I don't have a lot of leeway when bringing the shadows and highlights up or down. I don't normally stay in one area for too long. Once I feel as though I've explored it and don't see a lot of elements, I'll move on. I'm not sure what I thought I would get out of this photo, but it's a very boring photo. Now I'm making my way back to the car, and so the light is going to be different because now it's behind me instead of in front of me. It can sometimes be good to backtrack your steps because it gives you the opportunity to see photos from the other side. Here the lighting was pretty good, but the subject wasn't very interesting, and I don't like the angle that I was standing relative to the bridge. Here I found another garage, and like I said before, I like using garages as frames. One of the downsides to my particular style of shooting is you kind of do have to sit and wait for a while, which is what I'm doing here. I'm checking in my exposure to make sure that I have it where I want it to be when a subject does walk into frame, but I kind of wish I had been checking my focus because, as you'll see, the end result is a little blurry. The lighting here also isn't very interesting, it's pretty flat. Normally when I'm shooting into garages, I like to do that at night, that way the garage itself is more lit than the outside. It can create a better silhouette of subjects and make a more interesting photo. Well, it sure does get dark pretty early now, but I guess that happens every year, so just try to get used to it. So obviously heading home now. Next step is to edit the photos, which is actually going to be my next video. So if you're interested in how I edit the photos, what presets I use, how I decide whether it's going to be color or black and white, stick around for next week's episode. But yeah, I hope this was informative, if not entertaining, and as always, thanks for watching, happy shooting, and I'll see you next time.